Good afternoon. My name is Winnie Stackelberg, and I'm Executive Vice President for External Affairs here at the Center for American Progress, and it is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to CAP today for this important event, one that I know will help build on conversations that are already happening with increasing frequency around dinner tables, in workplaces, and throughout churches, synagogues, and mosques across the country. Here at CAP, we are well aware of the integral role that faith and religion play in our public life. For many families, it's the anchor of their community, a constant source of guidance, and a unique pillar of hope. From town squares to halls of Congress, no matter what the era or issue, religion has played a central part in nearly every public policy debate and civic conversation. Unfortunately, the rise of the religious right over the last few decades too often eclipses a longer and larger truth that throughout our country's history, faith and religious communities have been a driving force behind many progressive efforts, from calls for peace to movements for equal rights. Despite the fact that today some of the loudest voices against LGBT equality often emanate from the pulpit, we also know that there are countless houses of worship providing safe spaces for gay and transgender youth, faith leaders in every state modeling love and affirmation of LGBT congregants, and everyday believers warmly and compassionately embracing their LGBT family members and friends. For the last 2 decades, these voices and conversations have spurred action and changed hearts around lesbian, gay, and transgender identities. Increasingly, they are doing the same around transgender identities. Both the resource authored by Gene Robinson and today's discussion seek to push that effort forward by providing those with open hearts a framework to understand transgender identities through the words and traditions that have helped their own lives. This past May, CAP hosted a convening of transgender and allied faith leaders to discuss a theology that welcomes rather than rejects the reality of transgender people and their identities. This new resource by Gene Robinson reflects on that convening and utilizes his powerful place and voice to explore how religion and scripture call on us to build inclusive communities for people of all gender identities and backgrounds. As we saw in Houston, religion can be used to divide and demonize, but it can also be a force for calm and loving dialogue. And while differences will ultimately and inevitably arise, it's through these conversations that understanding flourishes. If 2015 serves as the transgender turning and tipping point, then 2016 must be the year when we move past the headlines and finally, as a country, engage in a deeper, more nuanced conversation about both what it means to be transgender and how we can create communities that affirm and respect the dignity of all people and their identities. And it's now my pleasure to turn over the program to someone we are very lucky to have working with us at the Center for American Progress. Someone who has made LGBT inclusion with both religious and secular institutions his life's work, Bishop Gene Robinson. Gene joined us after a trailblazing tenure as the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire. In 2003, when Gene was consecrated bishop, he became the highest-ranking openly gay person within the worldwide Anglican Communion and sparked important conversations around the globe about the need for welcoming faith communities. Today's event and the resource we are releasing along with it are products of Gene's efforts and vision. And now it is my honor to introduce CAP Senior Fellow and a very good friend of mine, Bishop Gene Robinson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming on such a cold day. I know Winnie's going to have to leave momentarily, but I want to thank her right off the bat for letting me do this very strange thing here at CAP. One would not necessarily think of the Center for American Progress when one is wondering about things biblical and theological. What this means is that indeed CAP is a place that thinks very, very broadly, and I am the great beneficiary of that wide open attitude, which permitted me to do this work, and I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank my boss, Laura Durso, and the LGBT team with whom I work here. What an honor to be a part of this group. I'm like the old guy that hangs around and learns from them every day. And by the way, if you want to tweet about this event, you can do #transwelcome. Let me be very personal to begin this with a story that changed my life, or people that changed my life. A year and a half ago, I got a call from two of my colleagues on the LGBT team here at CAP, Andy Cray and Sarah McBride. Andy had just received from a doctor a 2 weeks to live diagnosis, and they called and asked if I would marry them. It was my great honor to do so. And in about 4 days, those of us on the LGBT team and many of Andy and Sarah's friends put together a wedding. We thought we might actually go into business, like wedding in a week. Doesn't that sound like something you would purchase? 4 days later, indeed, I got to marry them, officiate at their wedding atop the building in which they lived. And 4 days later, Andy died. And 2 days later, we buried him. So those of us who planned that wedding also planned that funeral. But for me, being welcomed into that community by mostly transgender people was an astounding moment in my own life. And I learned so much. And they gave so much to me in the middle of that tragic and sad event, and I think we all made it into a triumphant event for Andy. And so I really want to dedicate this new resource to Andy and all the great work that he did. About a year ago, I had the feeling that while we had done the biblical and theological work related to homosexuality, that not a lot had been done, and what had been done had not been popularized around the theology and biblical references for gender identity for transgender people. So I called up some transgender leaders to see if my suspicion was correct, including Maura Kiesling, whom I consider to be the grande dame of all things transgender, who said, "Oh my gosh, yes, please do this." And so we invited half dozen transgender people from around the country to join three of us here at the Center for American Progress to brainstorm what it might be like if you were to make the case, a biblical and theological case, for the full inclusion of transgender people in the lives of our congregations, be they Christian or Jewish. And these people came and we brainstormed how we might go about such a task. And before saying a little about that, I want you to meet them. We have a very brief video of some of the participants in that consultation from which we designed this resource. So if we can roll that, that would be great.
All through my life, I remember going to bed and praying, just praying for God to fix me.
I came out to myself as transgender when I was 18.
We were having conversations about sexuality, mainly about homosexuality and heterosexuality, but trans wasn't really on the map.
It was at church, though, that I felt like I really could be who I was.
I didn't have to pray to God to fix me. I just had to realize that I was made perfectly in my mother's womb.
You often hear a sense of an assumption that trans folks are rejecting the body that they were created with, and that in some way we must believe that God made a mistake. And perhaps some folks might use that kind of language. It's not language I would use.
The Bible is actually quite clear in a number of places about it's not our role to judge what other people are doing, but to provide an expansive space for those people to have their own experiences of God, and our individual community should reflect that.
Oftentimes people do not have guidance. They don't have a community of people who affirm them. They don't have people to talk about very important parts of becoming oneself or their journey.
The first thing that has to happen is we need trans people in the community to begin to appear. And the only way they appear is where pragmatic room is made for them.
When our churches or religious communities are well versed in the experiences of LGBT people, when they believe in a God that affirms LGBT people, that person is able to say from the perspective of their faith that they belong to a faith community that affirms LGBT people, and it helps change the narrative both in families and I think in our communities.
There are things that we really should be working for and helping each other as human beings rather than judging each other on how we dress or how we present ourselves to each other or who we love and who we marry.
If it's religious texts that are supporting our willful blindness, then we need religion to help us undo that blindness.
Our tradition offers us life-giving resources, ways in which we can view ourselves, understand ourselves, and come into ourselves and grow. And that needs to be known.
So those are some of the people that we had at the consultation. All of the people that you see in the video are transgender, except for Steve Greenberg, who is a cisgender or non-transgender Orthodox rabbi. Not exactly an easy road to travel, being a gay Orthodox rabbi. Also joining us was Carolyn Davis from the Faith team here at CAP, Sarah McBride on the LGBT team, and myself. It was a wonderful experience, and I just want to say one thing about sort of how we went about that. Jews have a great tradition of playing with Scripture. Steve Greenberg reminded us that Jews believe that God would never be so small and narrow-minded as to put only one meaning in a word or in a piece of Scripture. And so the Jewish tradition of really wrestling with Scripture and looking for the many meanings in it is what is really so productive. And so we adopted that in our consultation to begin to play with the idea. If you were going to make the case from a biblical and theological perspective for the full inclusion of transgender people, what would it look like? And that's what we're hoping to offer you in this new resource called Transgender Welcome. Joining me this morning in this conversation is someone for whom I just have an amazing amount of respect. She is arguably the first openly transgender person ever to be ordained by a Baptist church. Yes, you heard that right, Baptist church. Leading MSNBC to label her as the most radical preacher in America. She knocked me from that throne, I guess. Allison is a senior consultant at Cook Ross Incorporated, a DC-based consulting firm advising clients in leadership and management, organizational development, and diversity and inclusion. She previously worked at the Human Rights Campaign and also became the first transgender person to head up a national LGBT organization, which was OutServe and SLDN, reflecting back to Allison's service as an Army officer, and this organization supported both active and veteran members of our services before the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. She has pastored Baptist congregations. She studied at West Point, Baylor University, and the University of Oxford, and earned degrees, this boggles my mind, in both physics and I guess you would say metaphysics or theology, right? She and her wife of 21 years and their 4 children live in suburban Washington. But the best thing about her is that she is my friend, and I am honored by that. You may have seen her recently on the season finale of I Am Kate, where she officiated at Caitlyn Jenner's renaming ceremony. So she can not only tell you all about Kate, but about the Kardashians. So with those remarkable credentials, let me welcome Allison Robinson up, and we'll have a chat. Great. Thank you. Here. Thanks. So, hi.
Hi, here we are.
Here we are.
Congratulations.
Yeah, well,
I'm so really just thrilled that this resource finally exists and is ready to be launched into the world.
It's probably as close as I will ever come to having a baby. It's taken just about as long to produce. Arguably, 2015 was an amazing year for transgender people, sort of unprecedented visibility, and at the same time, awful violence against particularly transgender women, and even more especially transgender women of color. How would you characterize this moment for transgender people in America?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say, Jean, is that these things are both true, right? That not only have transgender people reached a level of social awareness, right, and in part due to my friend Caitlyn Jenner, but of course Caitlyn's just riding a wave, right, that has been building and building for some time, arguably for decades. At the same time, 2015 saw more hate crimes against transgender people than any year since we've been keeping record. I can't help but imagine that those two things are probably linked in some very profound and complex ways. I think this is a pivotal moment for us as community. I think it is a hungry moment for us as society. We have arrived at this level of social awareness. But awareness in and of itself is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to protect us against violence. It's not sufficient to ensure our welcome in communities of faith, that we will not be discriminated against in employment, and so on and so forth. For that, we need a level of education, right? And I think that's the moment we're at right now, which is why I'm so excited that this resource is now available.
What would you say is the biggest hurdle for a transgender person of faith in reconciling their faith with their gender identity? And in your experience, what's the religious or faith or spiritual issue that those of us who are not transgender have in terms of our dealing with your community?
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. I want to caveat all of this by saying something that my friend and mentor, Mark Kiesling, said years ago that's always stuck with me. When you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person, right?
Wait a minute. You're not here representing
No, thank you. Thanks for making that clear today. I can speak to my own experience and to the experiences of so many that that have been shared with me through the course of my work over the last decade or so. And I think that for many of us, the first and greatest challenge is simply to hold both an authentic understanding of our gendered selves and our understanding of ourselves as people of faith together. Another person to whose work I'm deeply indebted, Reed Vandenberg, who's a therapist practicing in the Pacific Northwest and is a transgender man himself, writes about this in his book Transition and Beyond. He describes it as a two-world collision. And he says in his experience as a therapist who'd worked with many, many transgender people over the years, rarely do both of those worlds survive. Typically, either one rejects their faith and in order to embrace a wholeness and health that they've been seeking, or they seek to reject their gendered selves because they believe that that's what is required of them to be worthy of the love of God and of community. So simply finding a way to hold those two things together and keep them from destroying one another is a significant challenge for many of us who identify as trans and as people of faith. I think to answer the second part of your question, for faith communities, I think that even though many of us come from faith traditions that are broadly welcoming and enthusiastically affirming, we have to sort of acknowledge that we come from, in many ways, a social background and an ecclesiological background, which has some very rigid and strict ideas about gender roles, historically speaking. We see these boundaries being policed in some of the very earliest of the ancient Hebrew texts that we have. Over time, we have grown to claim for ourselves, to consciously choose for ourselves values of welcome and inclusion and equality. But those other things, those other ideas can be very deeply rooted within us. And so being around people who sort of flout those boundaries, right, can feel challenging, even in deep ways, even when our values would indicate otherwise for us. I think all of us, trans people and the communities that seek to welcome us alike, we can take hope, right, from the example of Jesus, who was also kind of all about flouting these boundaries, whether they were boundaries of gender, boundaries of clean and unclean from the scriptures that he grew up with and seek to follow suit.
It's amazing to me, particularly when Christians try to enforce those traditional boundaries, and yet worship a man who defied many of them, was single, as far as we know, in a world that virtually demanded that men be married. He spent his time with a bunch of men, and one of them is called the one whom Jesus loved, right? So it's very interesting that in the midst of following this particular person, we want to solidify those boundaries, which leads me to ultimately ask you, why do you think the religious right is driven crazy by this? Let me preface it by saying, recently in Houston, with the repeal of the Equal Rights Ordinance for that city, we saw not gay or lesbian people being used, but transgender people being used to frighten people, and they had, creepy old men wearing lipstick following young girls into the bathrooms. Why does that work? And what is that fear about, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, just briefly, I think that the reason that it works goes back to the deep unconscious fears that I was talking about a moment ago, right? We have this idea that regardless of our chosen values is kind of impressed upon us from a very early age by all kinds of sources in society, that there is, number one, that there is a clear boundary between the two sort of socially allowable options of gender, and that boundary is impermeable, right? And that to seek to cross it is to commit some sort of grave sin against society, right? This is why both kids like you and kids like me get beat up in school. Long before we've ever come to terms with our sexuality or our gender. As we begin to move close to those boundaries, others feel that it is their duty to impress upon us in no uncertain terms that those boundaries are sacred and are not to be crossed. We know from, as you said, from our study of scriptures, both ancient and somewhat less ancient, right, that those boundaries are not impermeable at all, that those boundaries, in fact, mean very little to the God that we claim to worship and that we claim we belong to. So I think it works because of those kinds of deep-seated fears. And frankly, I mean, as a parent, right, as a mom of 4 children, I was not comfortable sending my children into the restroom by themselves when they were little. But of course, that worked. These kinds of boundaries that the religious right has sought to hold work against me. Because kind of under their regime, I would not be allowed to accompany my daughter to ensure her safety into a public restroom, for example.
You know, it also strikes me that both with religious people and non-religious people, that a lot of the anxiety we see in the culture is related to the world's changing so fast, and it seems that one of the challenges that transgender people present to the wider culture is we can no longer think that a human sexuality is as simple as 2 boxes, male or female, or gay or straight. That I think what we learn is that human sexuality is infinitely more complex than we ever knew or wanted to admit. And once you admit that it's very complex, then it sort of feels like all bets are off. Boundaries don't matter anymore. There are no more boundaries. And that anxiety, I think, in the culture is really easy to play on if you want to use it and stoke up people's fear.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it is particularly true of people from these kinds of faith backgrounds for whom you have created this resource, right? I speak from my own faith background. The church is a very small c, conservative kind of institution, right? We don't change quickly. We don't turn on a dime. And I think a lot of many church historians would probably say that's a good thing, right? Nevertheless, I think that that when the society into which we have been planted moves in a direction, right, that so clearly lives into the values that we as Christian people claim, I think that we have taken note, and we have shifted along with it. This is just society playing the prophetic role that God's people have always needed, even if they haven't always wanted it. And surely, if that God can speak through an ass, right, as one of the Old Testament stories sort of lays out, then God can speak through this society into which we've been planted, I think.
Right. If you need further indication of how slow our institutions can be to change, all you have to do is look at the Anglican Communion this week. But I digress. Would you describe your own journey in terms of claiming your identity as a spiritual one, and how so?
Yeah, definitely. I really would. I would call it a spiritual journey for me. I say that because the questions for me were always theological questions. Like many transgender people, though not all, I first began to understand myself as not fitting the expectations of my society very, very young. Some of my earliest memories are about kind of fighting with my mom, for example. I think it was probably an Easter Sunday, right, which is the time of year that we have this sort of grand Christian tradition of dressing children up in adult costumes and taking them to torturously long worship services dressed that way. And I remember sort of having this conversation with my mom about, why am I supposed to dress up like Daddy when I'm not like Daddy? Why can't anybody see this, right? So some of my very, very earliest memories, but as someone to whom a faith tradition was entrusted at about that same time, right? I was given this framework within which to understand this difference within myself, and the framework was sin. Now, I didn't need the church to tell me that it was wrong. I had kindergarten classmates, right, who made that very clear to me, and who, through whom I took on enough shame that I could have gone through my entire life without ever encountering the church, and still would have had that understanding. But because I was given that understanding, I, much like my friend Nicole Garcia, who contributed to the resource, I initially sought the aid of God. God, why am I like this? Please make me not be like this, or change me so that I don't feel this dissonance within myself. I spent about 30 years trying it that way, right? And at the end of about 30 years, I looked at my watch and I looked at heaven and said, okay, so look, it's been a while now, and not only have you not fixed this, but it's gotten worse. It has gotten harder and harder to live with, harder and harder to conceal. And in fact, it appears to me right now that the only path forward is to end my life. It seemed to be the only way that allowed me to some relief from my pain without bringing shame upon my family, my church, places like Baylor and West Point, institutions that had invested so deeply into my life, Baylor being the largest Baptist university in the world, where I came out, because I don't do anything halfway, Gene. And I was, like so many Christian people who experience this kind of dissonance within ourselves, was sort of left to grapple with that. What does this say about God, that I would be this way, and that God would not change this for me? Does it say that God doesn't exist? Does it say that the God I've been praying to is a delusion? Does it say that God does exist but is not compassionate in the way that my faith tradition has taught? Is God trying to teach me something? And if so, why haven't I figured out in 30 years what that thing is? Or is God just sort of taking glory in my suffering, right? Which, although it would appear to have some scriptural basis, sounds dangerously like torture to me. It took me another couple of years of wading through theological texts and Bible studies and talking to people on all different sides of the issue to arrive at the understanding that God had not fixed me because I was not broken, right? And that I was free. God had freed me to, in the words of the psalmist, I think, seek peace and pursue it, right? Not only through the texts and traditions of my faith community, the rituals and practices of that community. For example, I had sought exorcism for the demon of femininity that I imagined lived within me, but also to seek peace and pursue it through medical doctors, right? Upon whom God's hand rests as surely as upon any pastor who ever counseled me. Therapists, one of whom there in the Waco, Texas community where I lived and was studying at Baylor, quite literally saved my life and offered me hope the day after I believed that there was no hope left for me in the world. And other people like me, and frankly like many of the people who contributed to this resource, who walked this path before me, and who, once I became aware of them, showed me that there was a path to walk. I'm so grateful for those things.
The resource steers quite clear of seeing gender identity and transgender people as being worthy of shame, right? As being sinful and therefore to be scorned. And it steers clear of the notion that transgender people are broken and therefore at least worthy of pity, right? Which is incredibly condescending. And comes at it from the notion that transgender people are actually God's gift to us. What do you think God is giving us in giving us transgender people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you were to talk to my church family, the people of Calvary Baptist Church here in Washington, D.C., which is a congregation that served the nation's capital for over 150 years. It is the mother church of the American Baptist Churches USA, and aligns itself with some other really terrific Baptist organizations like the Alliance of Baptists, and which took, I think, an incredibly forward-leaning and prophetic stance in inviting me to be their transitional pastor through an important period of our church's life last year. I think if you were to ask them, they would say that that the gift of transgender people to that church has been an extremely verbose and long-winded preacher who nevertheless manages to hit the mark occasionally, right? And also a deeply caring pastor with a vision for the future and a love for the people with whom she's called to make it. But I think if you look at the question a bit more broadly, I think that we challenge the notion that that humanity itself is as simple as we often are led to believe it is. It is a very human bias to imagine that others see the world in the way that we see it, experience the world in ways that are roughly analogous to the ways that we experience them. And when we're presented with those who don't, our tendency can be, frankly, to sort of shut them out or to keep them at arm's distance, right? Because we're not quite sure what to do with that. This is certainly not what Jesus did. It's not what communities of faith in that tradition did before the arrival of Jesus. At least those that were seeking to live most deeply into the call of God. Now, they occasionally have had to be reminded of that, right? But I think by helping churches to recognize just how far-reaching the golden rule is, just how much empathy we have yet to learn and to practice in order to live into the aspirations of God for us, I think we provide a much-needed gift and a much-needed resource to the church beyond the gifts that each one of us naturally brings into communion.
I just have to register my notion that your statement about what you in particular brought to your congregation, I suspect, is horrifically understated. But we'll talk to them later.
Drop by next Sunday and ask
them.
Well,
maybe. I just might do that. I'm curious, in assuming that we're all, many of us at least, are members of congregations. If we were a part of a congregation that wanted to express our welcome of transgender people, what might we do? How might we advertise? What are the things that we could do to signal to the transgender community that this is a good and safe and wholesome place for you and the gifts that you bring?
I am asked this question almost every time I travel to preach or to speak in churches. And I need to start off with sort of the negating position, right? That unfortunately, no matter how many rainbow flags you hang up, no matter how big your pride booth is, right, or how gay your pastor is, those things alone will not be enough, right? And I think that that many gay, lesbian, and bisexual people understand this implicitly, that when you have been so deeply vilified and rejected by society, you assume that you're not welcome unless you are specifically told that you are welcome, right? And so the challenge is finding ways to do that for people who otherwise would never think to come through your door, right? Again, I think that being involved, right, in things that matter to transgender people, and being publicly involved is a great step forward here. Every year, in the third week of November, communities all around the world commemorate the International Transgender Day of Remembrance. This is a memorial that was established decades ago for transgender people whose lives have been lost to hate, by hosting an event like that, by having your staff or members of your congregation present at an event like that. It shows that you understand, or at least are seeking to understand better, right? By creating space for conversations like the one we're having here today. So many communities of faith now have, whether they frame it under religious education or Sunday school, whatever we call it, right? These kinds of conversations, facilitated open conversations with religious leaders in their community and others to discuss the issues of the day, inviting a group of transgender people to come and to share their stories, and then putting that out into your community, putting it up on your marquee, right, is a good step forward. And I think doing the work that's required to welcome transgender people once they do walk through the door is critical here, right? So, doing what needs to be done to ensure that transgender people don't need to fear using the restroom in your church or synagogue building is important. That parents of transgender children know that their kids will be loved and treated in a way that is that's consonant with their identity. Those kinds of things matter a great deal, right? It's because the last thing you want to do is bring us, imply that we're welcome, and have us come through the door, and then have an experience that's not in harmony with that.
Yeah, I sometimes despair of the way Episcopalians do evangelism, which would be like fishing, going out in a boat and just hoping that the fish would jump in the boat, right? You actually have to proactively do some things in order to be successful at that. And I love the idea of that showing up is a way to signal to the transgender community that indeed you're serious about these things, and you're not just putting up a rainbow flag and hope that does all the work for you.
Right, and unfortunately there's no sort of code phrase that you can include on your website or in an advertisement that are going to cause the transgender people in your community to feel welcome. This is not the enterprise of a day or an afternoon. This is a long-term enterprise. So probably the best place to begin is for church and synagogue leaders. If you don't have relationships already in your life with transgender people, significant relationships, then seek to build those and allow those people to answer these questions for you and with you.
Just another question or two before we turn to the folks who are here for their questions. I'm curious about something. I know as a gay man, I can point to the numbers of people who have come out as gay or lesbian as the single most important reason why we have made the progress we have made in terms of gay and lesbian people. And we know that by the research, that is the greatest predictor of a positive attitudes toward gay or lesbian people, is you know someone gay. Given the fact that transgender people, as far as we know, it's probably a smaller number of people, and given the high risk of coming out as transgender, never mind maybe just wanting to live a quiet life as the gender that you are, and not be out, how will we reach a critical mass, a number of out and proud transgender people, so that most people in America will know, at least by reputation, if not one-on-one, a transgender person?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would want to speak into that, I think, Jean, is that we're still at a really early point in this movement, right? I've heard movement leaders talk about transgender awareness being 10 years, 15 years, 20 years behind social awareness of lesbian and gay people and their lives. And I specifically exclude bisexual people there because I think even bisexual people are not quite at that point. I just want to acknowledge that. And so, not quite sure where this is going, right? We have the numbers that we have right now are small. I strongly suspect that those, that the numbers we have today of how frequently transgender people appear in society are not very accurate in terms of what we will one day have 20, 25, 50, 100 years from now when we've successfully made this pivot away from these sort of strictly policed boundaries that we've been describing here. And until we reach that point, right, much like lesbian and gay people before us, we will rely heavily upon the commitment and the gifts and the sacrifices of allies. One of the reasons why I am so grateful to God for the Black Lives Matter movement in America right now is for what it is teaching us about that word ally, right? In other words, that simply feeling sympathetic toward a cause is not sufficient to make one an ally. Rather, it requires acting in solidarity with those who experience oppression. And the same is true for transgender people and gender nonconforming people. We need more people who will act in solidarity with us. Now, this is compounded by the fact that that gender identity expresses itself a little bit differently than sexuality. One of the ways that it's different is that it tends to express itself much younger. Right? Like I said, for myself, I knew from the time I was 3 or 4 years old precisely who I was, despite all of society's and despite all of the church's attempts to prove to me otherwise. That means that that as this number of trans people in society increases, many of us will be children who lack the resources for ourselves to advocate on our own behalf. Now, the great thing about that is that we will be accompanied by hopefully a very large number of moms, right, who make amazing advocates, and my mom kind of foremost among them. But for now, we desperately need people like you who are willing not just to express a sort of a verbal or spoken sympathy for the cause, but who are willing to step out and take on a cause that is not their own, and act in solidarity.
So let me speak just for a moment as an ally. In writing this resource, I will just admit to the audience here and to you, it was a huge learning curve for me, right? I mean, my heart's in the right place. I probably know more about transgender people than your average gay or lesbian person, who, by the way, I think are pretty much as ignorant about trans people as are straight people, right? Sure. And so I write this resource, and the first feedback that I got from this group of people that we called in for the consultation, I send them the draft, was devastating to me, right? And they said that I had put things in a way that was hurtful, would be hurtful to so many transgender people, and I was just horrified at that. And I guess what I would say to allies, potential allies, is you have to be willing to make those mistakes, right? And trust that transgender people will be patient with those of us trying to better understand. But you can't be so nervous about embarrassing yourself as to stay completely disengaged, because that's the only way to stay really safe, right? You have to jump in, and I will say, you know, Sarah McBride, my colleague here, is my sort of go-to person. She knows my heart's in the right place, and she'll tell me if I'm wrong or I've said something inadvertent that might be hurtful. It's important, I think, to build a relationship with some transgender people who will be honest with you, and that you don't have to be too worried about making a mistake. And I think in these days where political correctness seems to be very hot on the election trail, we have to get over our nervousness about these sort of everyday failures and see them as the gift they are. But if we don't try, we're never going to wind up being very helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, I don't think.
Great. One last thing, and then we'll open it up. What's 2016 going to be like? What unexpected things should we expect?
Yeah. Well, you know, I want to make sure that I'm not seeking to speak prophetically here. I can't predict the future. I just sort of work there sometimes. But I think that this tipping point, in terms of awareness, I think is behind us now. Right? I think that's history. I think we're there. I think rather now the work that is ahead is the work of education. Now, as a trans person, I have often railed against that, the very idea, right? Because so often in my almost 10 years of work here in Washington, when I've pressed for particular changes or asked why we are where we are and not ahead of here, people have told me, well, we just haven't done the education yet. I don't know that it takes a whole lot of education for us to do the right thing, right? You don't have to understand to show compassion. In fact, the truest form of compassion is the kind that comes without understanding, right? That said, I think that as more and more transgender people feel safe and ready to step into the spotlight and to speak their truth into the world, I think we will see both an increase in welcome and in affirmation in communities of faith and broadly in our society. I also think, sadly, we will see an increase in resistance to those things. The challenge for us is, I think, as people of faith, is to encounter that resistance with the same compassion that we seek for ourselves. Understanding what that looks like here at this moment, when so many of the battles of the culture war are behind us, and so much of the work of changing culture remains. That, I think, is our work. And I pray that, that we undertake it with the same fervor that we undertake the fight for our own recognition and our own rights.
Thank you. So now to you. Questions that you have about the resource, questions you have about the transgender experience, questions for either Allison or myself. And no, we were trying to figure out if we were cousins this morning, but we haven't. We'll get back to you on that. At the moment, we can't quite figure that out. Yes, actually, the gentleman right behind, and then right here in front.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today.
If you would just identify
Sure.
yourself, and if you're representing a group or whatever.
Sure. My name's Rabbi Adam Rosenwasser. I work here at a congregation in Washington, D.C., and thank you very much for just sharing your knowledge and personal experience. It means a lot. One thing you touched on a little was the sort of amount of children that are dealing with issues around gender identity. And we're seeing that a lot in our congregation. And I'm wondering, as a faith leader, how do we best support those children, especially when they have parents who, when the parents are supportive, as you mentioned, your mom, that makes life easy. When they're not so supportive, it puts us in sort of this strange spot as leaders who are looking out for their children's welfare, but also these are minors and they're sort of under, in a way, their parents' control. And I've been struggling with how we can sort of do a good job supporting kids who may be transgender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, gender expansive, whatever language you want to use. But I'd really appreciate some sort of, if you have any practical tips for supporting a gender nonconforming kid in Sunday school and religious school who does not have supportive family parents.
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi. What a critical question. I want to begin by saying I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist, and we're fortunate here in Washington D.C. to have some really terrific clinicians at Children's Hospital and elsewhere who I would really counsel you to reach out to and to seek their input into this very question. Right? I think that you'd find that very helpful. From my perspective, both as a transgender person and as a pastoral leader, I would say this: finding ways to communicate to children their value in the eyes of God, despite what society broadly may be communicating to them. This is our work as people who minister to children, right? With my own kids. From the time they were very, very little, when I put them to bed each night, I would sing to them a children's song of my own faith tradition. It was almost always "Jesus Loves Me." And then I would say to them something like this: Do you know that God is crazy about you? Right? Do you really understand? I mean, look me in the eye, because it's important that you hear this. Do you really know that every time God thinks about you, God smiles, right? That God is so happy with the way that God made you, and that God loves you just like you are. You don't need to change a bit to be worthy of the love of God, because God already thinks you're absolutely awesome and amazing. If only more of our children heard those kinds of things, right? And honestly, if they're not hearing them from their parents, then thank God they can hear them from us. And with, having said that, I as a parent, right, I also want to say that we make mistakes, right? With the best of intentions and the purest of motives, I can just wilt under the guilt of mistakes that I've made with my own kids, right? And I've probably made more than most. So I would hope that that we would be offering that same grace to parents, no matter where they're at, right? God loves you just like you are. God's really excited that God made you. All of us need to hear more of that, I think.
I would just add to that, is to see those parents as part of your mission field, right? Part of your pastoring. So what I often say to pastors is, naming is really important, and showing up is really important. So when you're listing examples of people we should be compassionate about or toward, come out as a transgender, gay or lesbian, whatever, ally, and you're just naming that up front. First of all, will be immensely comforting to those who identify that way. Second of all, when those parents finally come up against it, and when their kid gets to be 10 or 12 or 14 and comes out to them, they're going to remember that you said in that sermon that you understood, loved, cared for, respected transgender people. And so they'll know where to go. And you may not see the immediate fruit of that, but my guess is that they will remember that you are a person that would be helpful to talk to. Right here in front. And then there's one in the back there.
Hi, my name's April Fredericks. I'm representative of Integrity. I'm the Province 3 coordinator. Covers Pennsylvania all the way down to Virginia and West Virginia. One of the ways a faith leader can do this is what happened to me up in Milford. I went to church, and my church has a very gay priest, and he's out. And first service I attended, I walked out, and he's had a 20-minute conversation with me. And he used a one-to-one conversation using graceful engagement, seeing Christ in that person. And when you talk to somebody using graceful engagement, they will see Christ in you, and then you will communicate that way. I was a in-your-face activist 20 years ago in New York City. I have found it's much easier and much better if you just do it from the heart and almost on a one-to-one basis.
I had a really funny experience at our general convention, which is sort of the governing body of our church. We had 10 years of fighting over gay and lesbian stuff. So in 2012, we had a resolution that welcomed transgender people into the Episcopal Church as deacons, priests, and bishops. It passed with almost no resistance, which was mind-boggling to me. I made this impassioned speech on the floor of the House of Bishops, which ultimately didn't seem like it was very much needed, except that night I was out to dinner with some other bishops who had been elected in the same year, and a very conservative fellow bishop whose diocese is even more conservative in West Texas, said to me, can you go back over that stuff again about gender identity versus gender expression versus, he's like, I'm going to go home and my people are going to nail me to the wall about what the Episcopal Church just did. So can you teach me about this, right? There are all sorts of ways in which I think we can empower and give people the tools for dealing what is. I often said to my fellow bishops, gay marriage is coming to a theater near you, and I think it's safe to say at this point is that transgender people are coming to a theater very near you, maybe just around your corner, and you best get ready.
Well, and of course the thing is that if your congregation is over a particular size, chances are transgender people are already there, right? The Baptist churches that I pastored for 12 years would have told you, of course there are no transgender people here, right? Except there was one in the pulpit. They just had no idea. And as awareness continues to increase, we will be less and less afraid to say we're here, and please love us. Right.
Indeed. Right in the very back there, Billy. Thank you.
As you're asking your question, can I just offer this? And I'm a guest in the bishop's house here today, but I think I can probably speak for my friend Gene, knowing his heart. There may be those of you in the room for whom you don't agree with this, right? I, for one, would love your question as well, right? The more that we can talk about this as people of faith, the better we will all be, and I think the clearer reflection of God in the world we will be. So I want you to be welcome or to feel welcome in that regard before you move forward. So please.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Ken Dante. I worked as a psychotherapist with people that were recovering from addiction. So this is actually a little bit of a story of a transgender person who came for treatment in an archaic county facility that didn't particularly welcome transgender, had a great deal of difficulty with gay to begin with, and especially if you were black, that was another issue in there. But for a transgender, even staying in a shelter, that was a men's shelter, all these issues around earrings and how they were dressing and underwear, things of this nature. But I want to just turn something on its head a little bit. The whole emphasis has been upon loving the transgender. The other side of it was that people were not open to the love of this person who was so incredibly loving if you had the space to be loved by them. And so I almost want to tip this, because the whole thing is we should be loving this group of people, but there is love within this group of people that you benefit for. They're messengers in a sense too. And I think I was given this person because I was probably the only person on the staff who didn't have an issue. And I was open to meeting this person, but their love just came flowing out. It was also a difficult time where to have made waves around this issue in the system would have gotten this person thrown out of the system, which meant that their probation would have been violated and they would have ended up back in jail, which they eventually did anyway. But it was such a difficult mixture of knowing how far to push to assert a person's rights and how much not to endanger them, and that's a theme that you touched. But just to touch on that point, if you will express that about the lovingness, not in every single transgender, there's no they,
Right.
but in individuals, some are just, well, this one person in particular was just beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for that. I often talk about how much it has meant to me to be welcomed by these institutions that have meant so much to me. I frequently talk about it in the context of my alma mater, West Point, and believing that my coming out was in some way kind of building a wall between me and that institution that I just care so deeply about and love so dearly. The first time that I visited West Point after my transition, I arrived at the gate. My car had to be inspected, of course, along with my identification, which included, this was early enough that it included a clearly, an obviously male picture of me, my former name, and a male gender marker on it. And I was very, very anxious of the response of the young sergeant who was sort of looking at my documents in that moment. And he spent a lot of time looking at my documents and looking at me. But when he had finished and I got back into the car, he asked me if I knew where I was going. I was there to do some guest lecturing in the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership. And I said, absolutely, I'm a graduate at Thayer Hall. I know where that is. And as soon as I said I was a graduate, he stepped back, clicked his heels together, and saluted me. And then he said, well, then welcome home, ma'am.
Wow.
And I cried all the way to Thayer Hall, right? Because the welcome of these institutions is so very valuable. Pastor, rabbi, you're constantly looking for people to fill this volunteer ministry or this gap or this void in your community. Find someone like me who has been denied welcome and welcome us, and you will find a passionate laborer in your field.
In my experience, children who have experienced some form of abuse desperately want the love of the parent rather than the abuse, of course. And those of us who have been treated poorly by an institution have a huge stake in receiving a cleansed sort of attitude from that institution to be included where we were excluded. So I think that that's really, really true, especially of those places that have traditionally hurt us. Let's see, right there, right in the back, and then you, sir.
Hi, my name is Josie Lair, and I direct a project called the Men's Story Project, which is basically men sharing personal stories in public that aim to challenge and help transform social ideas about masculinity in the world for everyone's benefit. And I was really interested in, well, I've been interested in everything you've said, but when you said that when you meet one transgender individual, you've met one transgender individual. And I'm writing an evaluation study of this project right now. And I'm really wanting to better think and understand about the topic of prejudice reduction. Yeah, and what is the virtue of hearing people's personal stories, particularly people with whom you might not otherwise have had a personal or in-depth interaction, and how can that be valuable for that goal of prejudice reduction? And one of the things that I'm finding with this study is that people in the audiences have been finding it very valuable, to hear stories, personal testimonials from individuals who are transgender and gay, and of backgrounds just simply different from the background of the audience member. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. What do you see as the value add of personal testimonial sharing? And also, I'll just put out, if I may, a really quick offer, which is that we're also thinking about creating this project. I'm in conversation with a group of Mormons about creating this in Mormon community with someone who wants to convene a group of imams. So this is a project that is scalable, and I'd be happy to talk with folks also.
Yeah, definitely. Josie, thanks so much for your work and for your question. I mean, anecdotally, my experience is that that stories have a power like almost nothing else, right? To change minds and to move hearts. I say almost nothing else because even the power of stories pales in comparison to the power of relationships. Right, moving beyond having simply heard a story to becoming a part of the story of someone's life. The power there is unimaginable, and as I shared earlier, I think is still largely untapped with trans communities. But I want to also add the encouragement, right, that they don't need to be perfect stories, right? They don't need to be kind of well-honed and sharpened elevator pitches, but rather just our own stories, authentic, real stories about where we've been and where we're at right now and where we hope to go. The power in that is amazing.
Yeah. Let's briefly do this one last question, and then I want to take just a couple of minutes at the very end here.
Thanks, Rob Keith, and I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister doing consulting work at the intersection of faith and sexuality and gender and reproductive rights issues. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the ways these issues are connected, and in particular the kind of attitude of moralism that persists on the far right, where there's really only one right way to be in the world, and if you're found to be not conforming to that, then you're punished, versus this attitude of pluralism. And Allison, I'd be interested in hearing you talk about the ways in which you see kind of the struggle for trans liberation as connected or not connected from the struggle for kind of sexual liberation and for kind of reproductive health and rights as well.
I think that in many ways we're fighting the same demons in the world, right? In each of these movements, we have kind of in the most proximate sense named that misogyny, right? This understanding that women are somehow less than. My own experience of living out my trans identity in the world has taught me how much and how deeply misogyny underlies so much of the behavior that we would call transphobic behavior, right? And I think that many of my lesbian and gay and bisexual and queer friends have shared those experiences. I think it might actually go deeper than that, though, right? We, as human beings, have a deep-seated, deeply encoded fear of the other, right? It is a coding that is older than humanity itself. We see sameness as safety and difference as danger. This is why most of us, when we look around the 10 or 12 people that we feel closest to in the world, will see people who are mostly like us, right? Not because we're bad people or evil people, but because we're human beings who, by virtue of the way our brains work, feel more comfortable around people who are like ourselves. If we are ever to become more than that, right, we must learn to set aside comfort for compassion and step into spaces that feel that are unfamiliar, unusual for us, and learn what it means to embody our own unique humanity in those spaces, right, where our humanity is not shared in all of its details by everyone who is around us. In my own tradition, we look ahead toward an eschaton, an end of all things, right, in which we are all one. I think if you want to be able to experience that in the world today, you need to step into those spaces, and I think you will be deeply, deeply blessed if you do.
I want to end with something that I hope will send you to the resource, which is sort of occasioned our being here today. And I was reminded of it when Allison was saying that the people in her Baptist congregation were just unaware that there was a transgender person in their midst, and possibly more than one. I would say the same thing about the Bible, both the Hebrew scriptures of what Christians call the Old Testament and the Christian scriptures of the New, which is that there are transgender people show up, and theology that undergirds a healthy and wholesome attitudes toward transgender people show up. And I'll give you just one of them. One of the stories that we played with a lot in the consultation, just as a way of hopefully whetting your appetite, which is that, of course, there are two creation stories in Genesis. The first one is pretty much the one people are familiar with, which is, God has a certain number of daily tasks, and at the end of each steps back and says, "Woo, that's really good," and rests on the seventh quote-unquote day. The second creation story begins with the 5th verse of the 2nd chapter of Genesis. Comes from a different time period, written by different people. And in the first one, God creates humankind, male and female, boom, right out of the gate. In the second creation story, God creates the Adam, from which we quickly go to a man named Adam. But actually, God creates the Adam, the earthling, the human thing. And there's no mention of gender. And then, I'm so glad the rabbi is shaking his head yes. It's at that point that the first problem in Eden, which we normally think of as perfect, happens, which is the Adam, the earthling, is unhappy, is lonely. And God doesn't seem to know what will make the Adam, the earthling, happy. And that's when God brings all the animals to the earthling. And the Adam names them all, but at the end of the day is still lonely. And only then does God get the idea to create the out of Adam, the Adamah, right? And the Adam, the earthling, says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I think, and our consultation thought, what that means is that we, as created creatures, get to decide what makes us happy, what makes us fulfilled, what makes us whole. And that indeed we are co-creators with God in terms of what we will become. God goes so far, and then it's up to us to decide what makes us whole and happy and fulfilled. It's a very high notion of humankind, but one I think that is consistent with Scripture. So I hope you will enjoy the resource. I hope you will use it. I hope you'll tell lots of people about it. And thank you, Allison Robinson. What a privilege to be with you today. Thank you. And thank you all for coming very much.